The name of the session is Fiction, Memory and Colonialism. The moderator for this session is Pramji Minwala. Mr. Pramji Minwala is currently the chair of the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts at the Institute of Business Administration, Karachi. He has taught at numerous institutions including Yale University, Vassar College, Dartmouth College, the George Washington University, New York University, Fordham University, and the Zebist. His research interests include performance literature and history, visual and cultural studies, theatre and politics, media and film, and all forms of theory. Dr. Minwala was awarded a BA by the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, an MFA and DFA, both by the Yale School of Drama. The session is yours, sir.
Good afternoon. We have a really packed house. I'd like to introduce our panelists for today, starting at the end. That is actually most of these panelists, I'm sure everybody knows. H.M. Naqvi. H.M. Naqvi is the award-winning author of Homeboy, published by Random House in 2009. The debut was hailed as a remarkably engaging novel that delights as it disturbs by the New York Times, and as a genre-busting, page-turning book that fuses slang, literary discourse, pop culture, and politics, history and comedy, east and west. H.M. Naqvi has worked in the financial services industry, taught creative writing at Boston University, and run a spoken word venue. He has appeared on CNN, BBC, Bloomberg TV, and National Public Radio, and written for Forbes, Caravan, and the Global Coast on a variety of subjects. And his new book is being published in a few months, is that right? Or have you delayed it again? Sitting next to Hossein Naqvi is Christoph Petters. Christoph Petters was born in Kalkar on the Lower Rhine in Germany in 1966. He studied painting at the Staatliche Akademie der Bildenden Künste Karlsruhe.
Very great.
And was a student of H.E. Kalinowski and G. Neusel and master scholar of Moise. He then spent 5 years working as a passenger controller at Frankfurt Airport. He now lives with his family in Berlin. His two most recent novels were Herr Yamashiro, Beworzgut, Kartoffel, I can do this better in French, and Der Arm des Kraken. His work has received several awards, including the Aspekte Literaturpreis in 1999, the Düsseldorfer Literaturpreis in 2004, and the Rheingau Literaturpreis in 2009. Next to Christoph is Sadia Shepard. Hold on a second. Sadia Shepard is a writer and documentary filmmaker based in New York. She produced the September issue, an inside look at Vogue and the education of Mohammad Hussein for HBO. Shepard's first book, The Girl from Foreign, was published by the Penguin Press in 2008. Her other writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the Times of India, Wall Street Journal magazine, and the New York Times. She teaches creative writing at Hunter College and documentary film production at Wesleyan University. And the lovely lady to my left, who needs no introduction, Kamala Shamsi, is regarded as among the most accomplished Pakistani novelists writing in English. Hailing from Karachi, she is the author of 6 novels, including Burnt Shadows, which was shortlisted for the Orange Prize for Fiction and has been translated into more than 20 languages. 3 of her novels have won awards from the Pakistan Academy of Letters. In 2013, she was named among Granta's magazine's Best of Young British Novelists. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being here. So, part of the idea from this panel arose out of one of the central questions that scholars and theorists, I love theory, and academics ask about colonialism. So one of the things that people talk about in academic work and in research about colonial pasts is about the kind of collective amnesia, the kind of forgetting that happens relative to sites, locations of trauma, of subjection, specifically experienced trauma or subjection. But we rarely talk about what it means to remember and what the effect of those memories are on our work, on our bodies, on our minds, on our psyches, and on our cultural production, on the fictions that we produce. So I thought I would begin by simply framing. Can you hear me? Framing a series of questions for our panelists, and then allowing them to speak about their experiences and their work in relation to the coming together of fiction, memory, and colonialism. Okay? How do we remember the past, especially when that past has been and continues to be defined as a site of subjection and trauma? Does the past, remembered by colonizers, construct a narrative, a historical narrative, that colonized subjects find unrecognizable? In what ways are personal memories shaped or subsumed by national narratives that locate a colonial past as a point of origin for liberation struggle or liberation narratives, and also as a moment of rupture, the colonial intervention as a rupture of an organically developing history, what we would understand as an organic development of culture society. Does memory participate in the construction of personal, communal, regional, and national histories? I would say it does, but how does it do that? And what role does fiction play? Are memories themselves in fact fictions, given that we misremember or even dismember our own past in order to remember it? Does fiction, novels, films, plays, legends, public memorials, sometimes Pakistani history textbooks, help us remember, or do they refuse to let us forget, right? Or are imagined fictions the only productive ways for us to remember? The artwork that is produced about the past, especially past events that are traumatic, has been referred to by an American critic named Dora Apple as the art of secondary witnessing, where memory is a kind of secondary witnessing, and that the audiences that see this artwork are engaged in a process of secondary, not primary witnessing, looking again or looking back. And in a sense, that is what memory is. So, Hussein. Right? A few minutes. As long as you'd like, actually.
As long as you'd like.
Well, I happened to have spent the first 4 years of my life in Algeria. And I was thinking about, recollecting my very sunny childhood on the shores of the turquoise Mediterranean. And found that the imperative to recall was not an individual endeavor. I called my father up because I remember this incident that took place in the Atlas Mountains, that is an hour away from Algiers, where as a child I was feeding a monkey peanuts, and it was in the Atlas. It was cold in the Atlas Mountains, and I remember I was wearing mittens and feeding the monkey. The monkey swiped my mitten, and I remember this panic that arose, and I remember my father told me to drop my other mitten, and when I dropped the mitten, the monkey dropped his as well, and we retrieved it. So I called my father up and I said, "Do you remember this?" And he goes, it's been a long time. I don't. Because you told me to drop my mitten, I got the other one back. He said, "Do you remember the ants?" And I said, "I don't remember the ants." He would take me when I woke up in the morning to see the industrious ants collecting dinner. So my personal memories, I require somebody else to confirm. And in a piece that I wrote recently, I found that recollection is not merely an individual in Algeria. It makes the connection that I made is that the French colonial experience in Algeria was somewhat genocidal. In 1862, when the France took over, half the population was decimated by famine, by warfare. Half the population. But today, in public discourse in France, the French colonial experience is recalled as a civilizing process, a civilizing mission. And there are things that, the communal act of recollection is somewhat fictive. And so, memory plays an important part in shaping the way we think of ourselves. And we, as human beings, remember salient points of our childhood and neglect others. And I feel as sort of communities, as nations, we forget conveniently parts of our history that are painful, and highlight those that elevate our sense of identity. So this was a piece that I wrote, and I thought I would share it, and perhaps perhaps others have other ways of thinking about this particular issue.
When I saw the three subjects, colonialism, memory, and fiction, I of course felt I have nothing to say about colonialism, but in fact, of course, it is not true. As a member of Europe, and as I grew up as a Catholic, when I go back into the memory, especially of my childhood, there were many things which were indirectly related to colonialism. I remember when I sat in churches, every year, 2 or 3 times, there were collections for the Indians, for the Africans, and of course there were missionary stations held by German priests and nuns, and they were also on a civilization tour to bring the Indians in South America school, and I admired them very, very much. And of course, in this religious way, also the later German Republic was part of a kind of cultural colonization, and I was part of it because they loved to spend money. They were little Negro puppies, and they had a hole in the head, and they could spend from the pocket money you got from your parents one time a month or something. And I was very proud to give some money for these children, and so I supported indirectly, of course, the aeration of foreign cultures. But of course, I never felt guilty about that. And this is the one thing. The other thing is that, of course, the colonial structures of narration about foreign countries, the Arabic world, the Pacific world, the South American world, is full of all these pictures of colonialism. I grew up with flying rugs, and I grew up with bad Muslim like in the Karl May novels. I grew up with the strong Kara Benemsi. I know whether you ever heard of these 6 volumes by Karl May. Within Kara Benemsi took a trip through all the Oriental countries, and he was always the good one. And there were, of course, very dark characters in all over the Oriental world. And I grew up with this, and of course, I was on the side of the hero. And the first ideas I had of the Islamic people, what they were dark people, and no one knows how they react. They behave bad against their women. They are aggressive against foreigners. But on the other hand, there were the people who had flying rugs, who had jinnis, and the jinnis were in bottles, and if you open them, they give you a lot of power. And I was very, very fascinated of ornaments and all these things from the beginning. And this is the one thing, and then from this, starting to think about this, starting to realize this, I come back to the second part, which has to do with the relationship of memory and fiction, because actually that what I told you now in this moment seems to me in this moment as part of my memory, but of course it's the result of narrating myself, my mind, my personal history, my history of ideas of what I saw. Several times during every novel I write, I invent in a way my childhood again, and for the characters I invent childhoods who are related to mine but not exactly mine. I vision pictures of childhoods, I vision pictures of being adult person, and realize from one point I do not longer know which of this is memory, which is narration. For one significant example is, I grew up in this Lower Rhine area. My mother lived as a child during the Second World War in an industrial city called Essen, which was one of the main targets of the Allies to bomb, because they were part of the metal iron industry, they were for the heavy industry, they were very important for the German war machinery. And she was bombed out in their house with her family for 2 times, and they lost everything. And this losing everything and the bomb attacks and how they sat in the cellar and they were praying, and the few things she had with herself, and these stories I was told several times during my childhood. And also my father, who grew up in a village, they had a quite peaceful life during the war, but in the end the Brits brought the whole village into a dance camp where they had to stay for 6 months, I guess. And from all these war scenarios, I have very precise pictures in my brain. And I got these pictures since I was maybe 3 or 4 years old. When I was able to understand these narrations, I took them and I asked all the aunts and the uncles, tell me about the war, tell me about the former times. And when I started my first novel, which one of the main subjects has the displacement of the rural areas of Lower Rhine side, which were almost agricultural and archaic when I grew up there in this region, I realized that my personal pictures of my past are less sharp than the imagination of the childhood of my parents, because the narration brought so strong and colorful pictures into my brain that I really have personal memories on the bombing of Essen in 1944, which of course is impossible, as you might see I'm not that old. And from that time I started more and more to look closely on what I held for my memory and realized there's this permanent process of self-narration at every time from the point of view I'm actually in. Even whether I narrate myself as a painter, as long as I was a painter, I painted myself I narrated myself as a painter. I was painting since I was 3 years old, and I did paintings during my whole childhood, and then I felt these strong emotions while during you paint. And then when I switched more and more to become a writer, I just realized I changed the narration of being myself a painter to become myself being a writer. And I realized, wow, in my early past there were many signs that showed that I would become a writer one day. And so the more I think about all these things, it's no matter whether I reflect my childhood, I had a childhood where I had terrible parents, and I had a childhood where I had wonderful parents, I had a childhood which was very lucky, and I had a childhood where I was always unhappy. And all these childhoods are only one, because it's mine, but it depends completely from the personal state I am actually in, and from the situation of the relationship with my parents, with my brother and sister, what kind of narration and what kind of view on these personal memories I have. And even those memories, as I told in the example from the war scenes I have, get completely falsificated by narration from others, because the narration in words, in my case, makes such strong pictures that I remember more precisely than playing soccer with my friends in the street during 1972 or something. So this permanent interplay between memory and fiction, where we never come on a clear view what really has happened, and the longer it is in the past, the less we know what really happened, and I fear, in my lifetime, I never will know anything what really happened in my life.
Salia?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to everyone here for being with us this afternoon, and to everyone who's organizing this wonderful festival. I'm so delighted to be back in Karachi. Thank you, Franji, and my esteemed panelists. I'm really delighted to be here. As Franji mentioned, I wrote a book called The Girl from Foreign a few years ago, in which I trace sort of what was at the point of my beginning, an unknown part of my family history. Just to begin by telling you a story which frames my relationship to this subject. I was raised outside of Boston in the US by a Karachiite mother, my late mother, Samina Qureshi, and a white American father. And also my maternal grandmother, whom I knew as Nani or Nana, but was known to most people in my life as Rahat auntie. Her name was Rahat. And I discovered when I was about 13 years old, quite by chance, I was going through some of my grandmother's belongings in her bedroom one afternoon, and I found a pin. It was a school award, and it said awarded to Rachel Jacobs. And I said, who's Rachel Jacobs? And she got a kind of a faraway look on her face, and she smiled and she said, that was my name. That was my Jewish name before I was married. Which of course set off a kind of ricochet of questions in my mind. And first among sort of, if my grandmother had a different name and she had an entirely different identity, then sort of what does that mean? What does that mean, of course, for me as a 13-year-old child? What does it mean for my own identity? What does it mean to think that you know someone, think you know their religious and cultural identity or identities, and then to find that there are these multiple layers? And of course, we all have multiple layers, whether they are religious, cultural, national, these different layers of experiences and memories that, of course, make us who we are. But for me, this was a kind of a revelation that as a young child, that there could be these overlapping worlds within one person, within one family. The narrative that I was familiar with was one that takes place here in Karachi, which is that my grandmother, Rahat, was the third wife in a joint family that my mother was, my mother's family. And that at the time of partition, my grandfather had moved his 3 wives and 3 households here to Karachi, which, as you can imagine, was quite an undertaking. So three households that had never lived together, 3 wives that had never lived together, all of a sudden they're in Bath Island. So, and what I understood also was that my grandmother and my grandfather had a love marriage, and that this had been somewhat controversial. And in fact, my grandmother had kept her marriage a secret for 10 years, from the age of about 16, though she would never admit, to about 26, when she gave birth to my mother. And so once I discovered this news when I was about 13, all the rest of my grandmother's life, I would pester her I would ask her questions repeatedly, and I'd say, Nana, tell me that. So what year, how did you meet my grandfather? When did you get married? How did you keep a marriage secret for 10 years? How did you maintain relationships with your community, or did you, I had a million different questions. I mean, how do you navigate these multiple worlds, both in pre-partition India and then in post-partition Pakistan? And the narratives, what happened initially in my relationship with my grandmother, as so often happens, I think, in intergenerational relationships, but my grandmother didn't want to tell me the stories. These were sites of such suppression in her own life that it was too difficult, I think, initially, and also, frankly, too complicated to go into. And I think so often, again, we all have in our own families complicated narratives, complicated identities. It's often much easier to simplify. And so for my grandmother to live in the United States as a Pakistani Muslim grandmother was far easier than to go into the complication of what it meant to have left her Jewish community, to have chosen a different life, to live a polygamous life and marriage in Karachi, to then So you can imagine within the 20th century, here's a woman who went from a Jewish teenager to a Muslim wife and mother, ultimately became an American. So this is just, just one life. So I began to try and unravel some of these questions and to try and to make her tell me. And I got some of the answers. But the truth is that when you're separated from your history, as so often happens, especially with women of my grandmother's generation, she was born in 1917, so often we can get, there is a rupture in our understanding of our own histories. And this was the case. And certainly when you are exiled, whether it's for personal reasons or reasons of migration, suppression, so many different reasons, when your history is ruptured, there becomes a kind of fissure there that can be often difficult to repair. In my book, what I try to do is to retrace the steps that my grandmother took in her own life, and to also traces my own journey. Now, some years ago, as a student, I returned to India and then to Pakistan to try and understand some of this history and to try and understand some of the story of the B'nai Israel community, this tiny Jewish community, which also touches their history, touches Karachi as well. But in my own book, I understand this now only a few years later, it was in fact too complicated or too confusing for me, both as a student, as a person, as a writer, to try and understand Karachi's place in my own narrative. So my own narrative, my own understanding of my own history was to do with being a Pakistani American growing up in the US and discovering this identity about my Jewish grandmother in India. But the idea that there were Jews here in Karachi, that my grandmother actually had, it turns out, I discovered later, close relationships with Jewish families in Karachi. To me, the narrative became that my grandmother had been exiled from her own community. In fact, I learned that my grandmother and my grandfather went from Bath Island to the synagogue to attend holidays, to attend weddings. And this somehow didn't fit with my own understanding of my own history. When I returned after publishing this book to Karachi, I went and met with an old uncle of mine who I was very fond of. And I said, I wrote about some family matters in here, and I was concerned, I was worried what he might think. And I said, Uncle, I hope you would like to know what you thought, and I hope I didn't offend you in any way. He said, no, not to worry, you've written a novel. It doesn't matter. And I said, well, thank you, I guess, but I feel like I should tell you that it's actually not a novel. It's a non-fiction book. He said, no, it's a novel. It's a novel. And so, fascinating to me that sort of in order for him to understand it, and ultimately for him to accept it, it needed to be fiction. And of course, as anyone who knows, who writes fiction and non-fiction, there's tremendous truth in fiction, and there is tremendous fiction in memoir. And so, I reviewed that.
So much of what Sadia was talking about at the sort of family level of memory, as she was talking, struck me that you could talk about that in terms of the national history as well. In terms of you need to simplify that it's too complicated to allow in all the different aspects of what really happened. So you create a simplified version of who we are, where we came from, what was true, and that in some ways there's a necessity to this, perhaps, because the brain can only hold so much, but it does also cause ruptures with the past. Of course, being a writer from Pakistan means an endless fascination with the subject of how we define our own history. Most of my novels, in one way or the other, in fact all of them, have looked at some aspect of history. It means that, I feel I should say this because whenever I do a panel which involves talking about history, it always ends up as though sounding as though the fiction writers are sitting there saying, we're doing the more honest version of what historians do. So let's just clarify that historians do a very valuable work. It's quite separate. It's a separate academic discipline to what we do. And I'm certainly very grateful to the historians out there without whom I wouldn't have been able to write my books. But they're historians, and then there's the question of defining a national history. In the way that you define your family story. And it's a way of making you special. It's a way of making the nation special. It's a way of making the family special, that we are distinct in this way. This is what binds us together. Pakistan, of course, has a particularly interesting dichotomy in this, because we have the geographically bounded nation, and then we have the history of Muslims in India. And we sort of are always going between the two in terms of what our history actually is. There used to be many ways in which I was quite adamant that you simply had to say what happened here geographically is your history. And it's all equally your history. So the history of Gandhara is as much the history of Pakistan as the history of, I don't know, what happened in Lahore, the sort of Lahore Declaration. But that's also a problematic position, because how can you say, well, the Badshahi Mosque is part of our history, but Jama Masjid in Delhi isn't? That doesn't make sense either. And at a certain point I started to think that there's something quite expansive and wonderful in the idea that maybe you want to acknowledge that history is both these things. It's a history of where people came from when you have large migrant populations, because they bring that history with them, and it's also the history of what happened here. So Pakistan shouldn't be faulted for wanting to do both. It should be faulted for wanting to do one rather than the other. Where it should really be faulted is we want to say we tell the history of Muslims in the subcontinent, and that is our history. But we don't want that history to include, for example, what happened to Bengali Muslims in 1970. Right? What happened to Muslims in Delhi in 1857 is our history, but what happened to Muslims in Dhaka in 1971, let's erase that and let's forget about it. So we create this very problematic history. Every nation does it. Ours in some ways seems even more difficult because there's an entire war that happened in the lifetime of many people in this room. There was a severing of a nation, and it's not really part of our history. And I'm struck, you get struck by this particularly if you have Bangladeshi friends. And I was talking to one of my Bangladeshi friends recently, and I said, and this question had never occurred to me, I said, how does 1947 get taught in Bangladesh? And she started laughing. She said, well, it was a step towards independence in 1971. Right? I mean, their war of independence was 1971, our independence was 1947. It's endlessly complicated. It's complicated because you're trying to create a story out of incredible complexity, and what you need is simplification, and what a nation needs to feel good about itself very often is that simplification. I have enormous sympathy for anyone who wants to be a national historian of Pakistan, because I don't know where they set their parameters. However, for those of us who want to be novelists, it is fantastic, because there is so much that is yours. I've told the story before at KLF, but I'll tell it again. My favorite walk in the world, which took maybe 5 minutes, was in Peshawar. There's the world's deepest excavation trench in Gorkhatri. And you walk down the steps cut into it. And I was walking with an archaeologist, I was lucky enough, who was working on the site. And as you walk down it, he's pointing to the walls of this trench. And there are little artifacts embedded in there, which, you know, to me, I can't tell what they are, but he could, which was his job. And as we're walking down, he's saying, that's the British, that's the Sikhs, that's the Mughals, that's the Scythians, that's the Parthians, that's the Indo-Greeks, that's the Greeks, that's the Persian. We walked down 2,500 years of history. And there the trend stopped because they had run out of funding, not because history actually stopped there. And so as a historian, basically what you can, as a novelist, what you can say is every one of those steps is mine. And that is still the history of Pakistan.
Thank you, Urvi. I'm struck by how complexly all four of you have taken the notion of personal memory and woven it into narratives that you have constructed about, say, a national history and also a personal identity. And one of the things that I seem to be getting is that yes, indeed, fiction writers write more honestly than national historians. Though I would guess. But actually, so one of the things that seems that all of you seem to suggest is that, in fact, the writing of fiction allows you to explore ambiguity and nuance in a way that a national historical narrative cannot do. And that, in fact, the play of personal memory in relation to ambiguity and nuance is central to a reconstruction of the past. So, can we talk about that? And one addendum to that. There's a poem that what Sadia was talking about reminded me of a poem written by your mentor, Kamla, called the Dhaka Gauzes. And if you could talk about the Dhaka Gauzes in this context after, so, Hussein, personal memory, historical narrative, reconstruction of identities.
My Dadyal, when they arrived in Karachi, settled in a neighborhood called Paposh Nagar, which is in Nazmabad. My Nanyal settled in the neighborhood known as Namaish of Bandar Road. Both these narratives inform my persona, my way of making sense of this city. My next novel is set in other parts of Karachi, parts that I am unfamiliar with, because Karachi is, the sixth largest city in the world, and grows exponentially, has grown exponentially. So one comes across cantons in the city in a newspaper that did not exist 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There's places like Razakabad and Pipri, past the steel mills, and Kazafi town that just have sprouted yesterday. So when I sat down to write a novel about a place as complicated as Karachi, I figured I had to do some homework, and we have not, there's been a vacuum in our socio-cultural history. Socio-cultural history has been defined by the state till fairly recently. And so I found I had to do research in a different way. I had to draw on not printed material, not documentation, but on oral histories. And so if one comes at a place like, let's say, Garden West or Garden East, there isn't a hell of a lot you can find in print. So what I would do is walk around. If there was a scene that required me to have a sense of a particular neighborhood, I would walk around and happen upon a old house. I sort of had a sense that ये 50 साल पुराना है, 70 साल पुराना है, 100 साल पुराना है. 100 साल पुराने घर के बाहर हम खड़े हुए और बच्चे वहाँ क्रिकेट खेल रहे थे. तो हमने कहा ये किसका घर है? तो हमने कहा कि इसका घर है. So I then went back and made an effort to try to befriend the inhabitant, and at first they were very wary of sort of talking about the neighborhood, talking about their family in this particular neighborhood. But हमारी नियत साफ है और हमने कहा कि बस हम कहानी लिख रहे हैं, कहानी ही लिख रहे हैं, जैसे सादिया बेगम ने कहा. And so slowly but surely I would be able to tease out peculiarities of each neighborhood. The Cincinnatistown, which was the mecca of the well-to-do Goans in the city. Cincinnatistown was meant to be small garden plots. Garden, as we know, is called garden because the British mandated that there would be these small farm plots that would be given to people to cultivate. So that sort of, these sort of peculiarities हमसे पूछते कि आप जो हैं होटल जाते थे या साहिल जाते थे, तो कहते थे हाँ साहिल भी जाते थे, होटल बहुत कम थे उस ज़माने में, मगर हम मलीर जाते थे because there was sort of lush and there were orchards there and there were toddy trees, and so you would there would be a family excursion and the adults would actually cut these the toddy fruit, which would ferment and become more pleasing to the palate, and so this ethos, which is this narrative, this history that exists only in the consciousness of certain demographics here, will be lost if one doesn't attempt to document it in some way. And I'm not an anthropologist and I'm not a sociologist, I'm a storyteller. And so I find it imperative to employ reality in the service of fiction. I feel that fiction is a lie that tells the truth.
I don't know for what reasons, but since I was a young boy, I felt myself being a stranger. I was a stranger in the village and I felt like a stranger. The older I became, the more I realized that I feel as a stranger in the country. And when I started to decide that I wanted to become an artist, the people in art history I was interested in were not the painters of national panoramas and important scenes, but they were people like the late Rembrandt or like Vincent van Gogh, who turned into very radical individualistic positions. They were in a society, meaning they were completely fucked up. They were alcoholics, they lived in an extreme border between being mental healthy and being crazy. And I thought art and later on literature was the way to get out of all these overwritings, national mythologies and public official statements, and who I have to be as a German, who I have to be as a Catholic, who I have to be as a person from the Lower Rhine side, who I have to be as the son of a teacher, who I have to be as the grandson of a farmer. All these ideas other people brought to me were things I want to get rid of while becoming an artist. And I thought the only way to come nearer to some kind of relevant thing and to come to some kind of truth is if I look as precisely and as close as even possible to the things which are inside of myself. And of course, meanwhile, I'm a little bit more old and a little bit more wise. I realize that there are many national history things and personal and family histories who made me who I am and made me to see the world that way I see it. But still, I would say national history produces itself by mass media, meanwhile, and there are some good efforts in it, and then there are some good intentions of it, and many of them are also bad. I personally grew up in this divided country, Germany, and I had no nation I was part of, and the last nation my parents and grandparents had been part of was, so I realized in history lessons, the most terrible, most cruel nation the world ever saw. And I did never want to have any new relation to all ideas of a nation. And of course, you realize the state of the country you grow up in is the normal state, and so there was this divided country, and I had no relationship to any people in the socialist part, in the GDR. And this area I come from was cut from a major part of Germany through the Rhine, and I was related to the Dutch people much more during the centuries before than to the German people, because my region was part of the Dutch government and was part of the Dutch art history. So there were possible reasons why I hadn't a healthy or normal relationship to my national stand in the world, but the more I thought about it and the more I watched the history of the ideas of nationalism and the idea of a nation in general, and I had personally the feeling that it's one of the worst ideas mankind ever had. There, I guess, during the last 150 years, there's no religion that brought so many people to death like the idea of nationalism, and it's still in the Ukraine and in Yugoslavia and so many parts of the world. It's growing up again, and each tribe decides that they are a nation, not its own state. But I grew up in the European community, and then there was an idea, let's bring the walls and the borders as small as possible and live in a Europe of regions. And that was something I could identify. I come from a region I like, and this region has several kinds of histories through the last 2,000 years. The Romans were there, and before that there were German tribes. There was one very famous rebellion, also painted by Rembrandt, the Batava-Aufstand, the rebellion of the Batavians, took place in this region. This was part of my rebellion against these nation ideas and about all kinds of occupation. I can note this as my personal history, but of course it had nothing to do with really historical truths. But I think the narration as an author I am able to do is to individualize history, and to individualize without idealizing it, but just telling what happens, what hurts, what was fine, what was nice, what was beautiful, how the relationships between people had been individually, and not under the focus of were they relevant for the nation, were they a good part of the nation or not good part of the nation, because in the end, of course, all history is much more than the addition of simple personal histories, and but touched we were not by the history of nations, so I never have been touched by falls of empires or something like that, but I'm touched by a story one has who does a revolution, a personal revolution, and he gets killed, and I got touched by an unhappy love story, and I got touched by an artist who's fighting for freedom for his work and gets into struggle with his demons and fucks up whatever. These are the stories I'm interested in. And maybe when we focus more on the value of individual stories and realize how worthful every individual story and every individual life is, we maybe automatically improve the ideas what nations could be. They should be rooms where individuals could act free and could act with each other in a way without prejudices and without oppressing themselves.
I'm so interested to hear what Christoph is saying about this idea of individualized history or individualizing history. I was raised, as I mentioned, in the United States. I was raised by a homesick Pakistani, my late mother, Samina Qureshi, and she was actually a very proud nationalist. To understand, she came here in 1948 with her family and kind of came of age with the country, if you will, and then went as quite a young woman, the age of just shy of 16, on a boat with, coincidentally, H.M. Naqvi's father. on a boat as American Field Service scholars. And they spent a year, in my mother's case, many more years in the United States. And in this program, it's a remarkable program, sending these kids from Karachi all over the U.S. They were became unofficial cultural ambassadors instantly. So there they are, they're 16, they're in high school, and they need to answer questions about, well, what is Pakistan? And so this is 1961, right? So Pakistan is in its first years, really. And my mother took to this quite naturally, and really I think it defined her for the rest of her life. She walked into a room and felt that it was her role to explain, illuminate what Pakistan was. And she was not only a very proud Pakistani, but she was very deeply interested in Pakistan's plural history and in the history of pluralism within Pakistan. Now, knowing a little bit now, as you do, about her own, the history of inside her own family, this of course makes perfect sense now, right? Because if you grew up with this kind of confusion and complexity and different religions in one home, I think it's a logical progression. But so throughout my mother's work, she spent a lifetime going back and forth between the U.S. and Pakistan, and she made a series of beautiful illustrated books about Pakistan, visual culture and cultural production here in Pakistan. And I was reminded, as Hussein was talking about walking around Garden East and other neighborhoods, it's actually where my family originally landed, of an idea in a book called The Shadow Lines by Amitav Ghosh, if you know it, which has really shaped so much of my work, not just as a writer, but also as a documentary filmmaker, where there's a kind of central idea for me in the book about where the protagonist, when he finally goes to Dhaka, although he's going for the first time, he's walking paths that have been walked by others before him, tracing stories that he's been told. And this idea of being able to walk a physical path in a city that maybe you have a familial connection to, but perhaps are not intimately familiar with yourself, or a part of your own city that you perhaps haven't walked before. This idea of a kind of inherited memory, and can you inherit a memory? And so as I return to my mother's hometown, I'm reminded of this almost daily as I walk in so many places that meant so much to her and that she missed and became such an influence in her own work as an artist, as a designer, as a writer. So my mother's home in Bath Island was demolished a few years ago, and it's something that has always struck me is sort of what happens when the physical spaces that are our homes, whether they are a physical house or a country, how we define ourselves is so often based on what home is, and where home is, and when home changes in the dislocation that happened in partition, or in the dislocation that happens with migration, whether it's for economic reasons, for religious persecution, there's so many different reasons. What happens to our sense of home, and thus our sense of ourselves? And I've become very interested in recent years in false memory. And something, again, I drew not only on my own memories, but on other people's memories to create my own, to create my book. And one thing that, because there were so many stories that my grandmother didn't tell me, there was invention that I had to do based on interviews, based on talking to people, and based on a kind of, if you will, a sort of willful act of empathy. To try and I think that's so much of what we are doing as writers, is to try and project ourselves into another person's shoes, to individualize history. My training, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and what we do as documentary filmmakers is you go out into the field and you gather a lot of material, and then you come back when you're done. You gather it all, and then you come back to try and weave a cohesive narrative. And it's been, the last project that my mother and I collaborated on is a series of films called The Other Half of Tomorrow. We started in 2010. And it's a series of portrait films of women working for social change in Pakistan. It comes very much out of the experience of living in the West and answering questions, as you do, about Pakistan. And as you know, there are tremendous misconceptions about what it means, what Pakistan means, what Pakistan is like. And so this was a project initiated by my mother, and so what we did was we traveled around the country in between 2010 and 2012, interviewing any number of women working for social change in all aspects, all sectors of society. And we made individual portrait films, and it's been a very interesting experience in the last couple of years as I've begun to show the work and share it, especially with members of the Pakistani diaspora in the United States, among other places. And very often, Pakistanis in the West will say to me, they're like, well, these films are very nice, but why didn't you highlight, the famous people in Pakistan? We have some wonderful famous people in Pakistan. Why did you give me these ordinary people? And it's a question that we get a lot, and I guess the interest is, again, fascinating, but I said, sort of individualizing history. That the idea, very often we feel that history needs, in an effort to be comprehensive and collective, so often it's these quieter narratives, or so often it's the narratives of so often women's history that doesn't always get represented the way that it should. And so I'm fascinated by these questions and take them with me.
Speaking on that idea of individual history, it's interesting the way they get formed. My Dada's family, from my father's family, is from Delhi. They lived there, I don't know, 200-300 years. I first went to Delhi about 12 years ago. I knew this was where my family had lived for that while, and it was a matter of some abstract interest to me, but it didn't move me at all. And then I went away, and some years later I was writing a novel called Burnt Shadows, and part of that takes part in Delhi. And having written a draft or two of it, I found myself again flying into Delhi in, 2010 or 2008. And as I was flying in Delhi with all its smog and pollution came into view, I thought, this is where Hiroko and Sajjad met. Now, these are imagined creations of mine. They are fictional characters who I made up. But at that moment, I thought, this is where they met. And tears came to my eyes. I didn't think, though I could have, this is where my grandparents met. But it had something to do with this idea of what separates the history that you know sort of outside yourself from the one that you feel inside yourself. And that is to do with when history moves from fact, or from that part of your brain dealing with fact, into that part of your brain dealing with imagination. And I think that goes back to what you're saying about the role of the writer in creating empathy with historical moments. And you can find that you do that actually with historical moments and creatures who are not necessarily of your blood and of your history. I mean, this Hiroko was a Japanese woman who I'd invented. But I'm going to very quickly, Framji asked me to talk about the Dhaka Gozes. So we end with Aha Shahid Ali, who was the fantastic Kashmiri poet, and I hope everyone knows his work. And when you talk about history and art, and the Dhaka Gozes is a brilliant way to do it. I haven't read it in a number of years, but let's see how memory serves. It basically is taking that episode in history where the British destroyed the weaving industry of Dhaka. They wanted the raw materials of the subcontinent, but they wanted them all taken to England. And the weavers of Dhaka would cut off their own thumbs because they weren't being allowed to do the work of generations. And there's this beautiful passage where Shahid's standing with his grandmother, and she's remembering the Dhaka Gozes, woven air, she calls it, woven air running dew, and how you could take 6 yards of them and pull them through a ring because they were so fine. And it ends with her standing in this garden remembering this moment, and she pulls the dew-starched air absently through her ring.
That she recreates the memory in that moment at the end of the poem. But it's also really about, history, because he narrates the historical, the history of the Bengal weavers and their resistance and it ends that whole section with this really simple line that says, history of little use to her. Right? My grandmother, and then it goes on with her memory, and her memory of the gozes that will never be seen again, and that in fact the last goz that she experienced was a sari given to her as part of her dowry, which many years previously had been cut up into handkerchiefs and given to grandchildren. right? So it's really so that the entire poem sort of is structured around this relationship between memory and history and which is more important. And I think Al-Ash'ari actually refuses to make that kind of determination, and at the same time he does make that kind of determination.
But it's also one other thing, which is the relation between the oral narration and the written, because we're talking about it because Shahid wrote it down.
Yes, exactly.
So that's the other part of, what gets told is oral history and the different weights that has and the different factor, the different way in which it gets remembered.
Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? I don't think we have time for questions, and I apologize for that. But thank you very much for attending, and thank you to all the panelists for speaking so eruditely.